Hi, and welcome to another episode of Health Naturally. My name is Paul Gerst, licensed acupuncturist and natural health practitioner and co-owner of the Balanced Path Wellness Center in Medway. Today on the show, we have Pam Formosa and Christina Hayes of BrainFit Academy. Welcome to the show, guys.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having us.
Tell you what, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what you guys do, the meat of the show, if you will, let's do a little personal. Just share something personal, some personal information about yourself, just where you're from, education, how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, sure. So Christina Hayes, I'm from Northbridge, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure where I should be looking. Right there, that sounds good. Thank you. So from Northbridge, I have a background in education, and when I had my girls, which are now 23 and 25 years old, my youngest daughter, needed to be taken out of school and homeschooled in 6th grade. And so at that time, I learned about some natural movement-based therapy to help her to access what she was missing all those years.
Where'd you learn that?
And so I learned it from this Miss Pam Formosa,
okay.
Right? So Pam and I were in the same town, our girls grew up together, and I said, Pam, come on over here, help me out, see what's going on.
Sure.
And so Pam came over, she did some movement-based therapy, we saw the results right away, and I was hook, line, and sinker, I jumped right in, started learning.
Great.
And so then I ended up with my own business, Alternative Educational Support, where I did some tutoring, using that educational background I had, with some movement, so the kids could access their academics through this movement. And that worked so well. Pam and I, she had her own business, she'll tell you about hers, Pathways to Learning, and she and I began to talk about this root cause struggle that these kids were having, like, hey, how about those early motor patterns? Those are a big deal. How about we explore that together? And so we did some groups, and we began to build BrainFit Academy. So for a year, we held the groups, and we went across to Dairy Queen in Milford and had some blizzards and developed BrainFit Academy right from there. How about that? Those starts.
Hang on a second, I got to get over the fact you went to Dairy Queen. It's okay.
That was years ago.
That was years ago, but how about those organic root starts, right?
Gotcha.
There you go.
Pam, tell us a little bit about you.
Well, Paul, my background is occupational therapy.
Okay.
And I have always worked in schools helping children with learning challenges. And back in 2000, I took a Brain Gym 101 course, which is a movement-based therapy, really thinking it was just another conference to go to. And it was a 3-day course, and on the second day, I was realizing very quickly that I was changing. And this was not just for kids, it's for me.
Yeah.
So at age 35, after taking this 3-day course, my life changed. I did a 180.
Yeah.
I not only went part-time in my job, I opened up my first practice, and I also got licensed in Brain Gym so that I could offer this to the kids. Because at age 35, I made a huge change in my life. Over a weekend, what could I do with kids? So that's where the journey really started, is starting my first business, and I haven't stopped since.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and isn't that the case with most practitioners, is how it, something impacts
Personally.
them. And,
Personally,
so it's that
absolutely,
personal connection. That's why I start the shows off that way, is I want to hear how people, get through life to where they are,
Yeah.
Right.
Well, having said that, movement-based therapy, what is it?
Well, we move our bodies, and we move the energy in our bodies to reorganize our brain and our body connections. Does that make sense?
It does to me.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not sure to them.
Right,
Say more about it.
Sure. So sometimes we just are, our brain has a hard time communicating left, right side. Our, thinking brain, we have a hard time getting there. If we move our body, it organizes ourselves around that. For instance, walking into the show today, I was a little nervous, and
Great story to tell it.
Yeah. I got stopped. No one who knows me is going to be surprised by that, right?
She got pulled over by the police just to make it clear to everybody.
a little speeding. No one's surprised, I'm sure. So he was very nice, and he just gave me a warning. But I came in a little revved up from that. I needed to use my own tools to calm me down. So I did a little of, okay, I'm going to cross over my midline. I'm going to open up some, oxygen and blood flow to my brain, and I'm going to just relax myself with some hookups. And I did that, and then everything calmed right down, reorganized my system.
And
so
I
was
watched
ready.
her do this, and it was effective. So.
Oh, good. You could see the difference.
Oh yes,
Oh,
I
here we
could
go.
watch you calm down. It was fun to watch.
Oh, there we go.
That's
Beautiful.
fun. That's fun.
Yeah.
So say more about the work you do in the sense of, like, well, let's do this first before we proceed with your work. What's the work based on? So where is this work rooted?
It's rooted in kinesiology.
Okay.
So yeah, and I want to give you a chance to speak. Nancy,
Yeah,
if
no,
you wanna speak
absolutely.
to that.
Kinesiology is the basis of this, but it's also the mind-body connection in that when you move, that's very important, but when you start to attach the movements to goals and a lot of detective work, noticing what's going on inside and outside, and then move around that goal, that's where the power is. And that's what we educate kids from day one, kids and adults from day one. It's not just about moving, it's about attaching that goal and the noticing piece with it.
Right, mind-body connection is huge.
So, okay. There's just so many parts I want to understand here. How does it work? I mean, how does I use this in my practice too, but I'm curious for you to tell me how,
Right.
or tell them how it works.
Right. Well, think about babies.
Okay.
Babies move.
Yep.
No one tells them how to move, they just figure it out. And there's a template in their system, there's a template in all of our systems that help move along the growth and development of the brain and body.
Yep.
Okay.
All starting in the brain, correct?
No, it
No,
actually might
in the
start in the
body.
body.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because those rhythmic movements that babies make, or those reflexive movements like
Sure,
that startle,
sure.
that is actually governed by the lower part of the brain stem. But the body makes that movement, and it facilitates sensory processing. And so it's actually the movement piece that starts before the sensory processing, which then is enabling the brain to develop to a higher level.
So making brain connections, it's making neural connections.
Yeah.
So every time, the baby flinches or the reflex is activated by hitting a uteral wall or something, it's going to begin to make that connection of my body and my brain, right? So it's
Okay.
going to begin to make those neural connections. Information like, oh, there's my arm, I just felt it, send a signal up to my brain stem, getting that information.
Okay, so that being said, your business wouldn't exist if there wasn't a problem to solve. So what's the problem?
Well, the root cause that we work with most often is that developmental piece. So somewhere back in utero and first year of life, development stopped up for many, many reasons. It could be there's a lot of emotional components to this where, the parents had an emotional time during that pregnancy. Maybe a fender bender, somebody I was just speaking with, we got into a car accident at 5 weeks into utero. I was nervous the whole time. What did that do to my baby? So all of that, it can stop up because of, C-sections or whatnot, but with no guilt to any of this, because we do what we
Excuse me.
can, we move along and do what we need to do,
Is there also emotional or emotional trauma? Or
Yes.
Are you looking at the same underlying causes that I would in my practice?
Right. Well, we're looking at stuckness. So where in the development
Okay.
did things get stopped up?
Okay.
And let's go back there. We can tell where it got stopped up by the behavior of the child, the immaturity. They are maybe 5, or we work with infant through adult. So at any age, we can say, this is where you get stopped up in your development. Socially, things are hard. Physically, fine motor, gross motor, things are difficult. Let's go back where that was getting developed. Let's go back where those neuro connections were being made and didn't get a chance to yet be made as a solid foundation for these higher level functions.
Right. And I think what we see often is anxiety. That's the biggest complaint that's coming in the
Okay.
door right now. And no one knows why this kid is so anxious, or attention deficit. When it may not be ADHD, it may be clearly it's an attentional issue or challenge, but where's the root cause of that challenge? So those two, learning disabilities sometimes, kids on the autistic spectrum, and we don't really key into the diagnosis as much as let's look how well the brain is developing. Are there immaturities in the brain? Is there disorganization in the brain?
Yeah.
And we see that through their movement patterns and their behaviors. And we
Yeah.
can identify really quickly what is going on, and then, which is great because now we can do something about it. This isn't necessarily something that has to be. I mean, I changed my life again at 35, but then at 40, it was another aha moment. When I took my first primitive reflex class, they were describing the Moro reflex, which is the primitive fight-flight. And it protects us when we're in utero in the first couple months of life. But if it didn't integrate into a higher level startle reflex for one reason or another, and there's lots of reasons, I had a very traumatic birth, so that may be part of it. What happened to me was I was very oversensitive to touch. I was very oversensitive to smells. I got overwhelmed very easily. My mother would tell you I was a very moody kid. And right through high school, college, I was moody, but I would become overwhelmed in social situations. And so I just thought that was who I was. So I spent a lot of time by myself. I loved to play in the woods, and just that was my calm space. And when at 40 years old, I'm in this class saying, wait a minute,
wow,
you're describing me. And I'm like, what do I do? And they said, oh, we'll integrate your Moro reflex. And I'm like, huh? And they said, yeah, we're going to do these movement patterns, and we're going to go back and reorganize your brain and body system to complete the template that never finished.
Okay.
And that's a good point right there. So we all have a template. We all have the same template of the human beings, and we need to move through that template in a systematic, sequential way.
Ideally, yes.
And if we don't, then we do find that we're frustrated or we have anxieties later on in life. And the anxieties are just because our body really wants to continue on with that template, and it's stuck, and it's feeling stuck. And so, one of the movements is that if your head moves to the side, the ATNR, then your arms do. So now if I go to right and my head is up, I'm going to want to still have that connection between my head and my arm, and it's going to be, causing me some stress in my system and then some anxiety.
Okay. What kind of tools do you use to achieve the goals?
Right. Well, you saw me use some of those tools earlier when I came in.
Yeah. Some of the same ones I use in my practice.
You do?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's our midline. Let's cross over that midline and try it at home and see if your kids can do that, because if you can't, then, you know what, I need to do some of that, and life will be easier because I'll have some left-right brain communication, better in sports.
Right. It's interesting, and we can all be better. There's no doubt about it. So this isn't about anybody specific. You don't have to have a diagnosis. And like I said, I made a lot of changes for myself, but I went into my daughter's volleyball team many years ago, and I did some brain fit work with the team, getting them ready for their game, and we got to that cross crawl part. And here you have high school athletes. Some of them couldn't cross over. They were like, what? And it was an indication that either their body was under stress, or those neural pathways have never been fully developed to really get access to both sides of their brain.
Integration.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So imagine if you had better connections, how much more athletic you would actually be. You could really refine your skills.
Yeah.
So that it can be used in all areas. But that's an example of one of the movements. But we use tapping, which is an emotional freedom technique sort of thing.
I teach it in my practice too.
Rhythmic
a lot of the same
movements.
stuff,
We really have our tools broken. We have our tools broken down into 3 different categories, pretty much. Developmental movements. We're going to go right back to development and do what babies do. We have pictures of babies. We're going to roll on the floor. We're going to crawl. We're going to do what babies do. Okay, so that's one. We have some assisted movements. That's some hands-on, work where we're going to, release your positive points. Like we're going to release, we're going to do some hands-on energy work, perhaps, to get that energy moving throughout. So we have the assisted movements. Then we have our active movements, which are those cross crawls and movements that we can do ourselves. We have some videos up on our YouTube channel that where kids can watch and go along with us and do some of these active movements.
So it's really you're teaching people things they can take with them.
Absolutely.
It's not machines that you're using in your office. Things like that.
And because when a baby is developing, they don't need anything but their own body,
Right.
and that's what we go right back to, that basic development. And we also want to say that these tools are not compensatory tools. These are tools that organize our system. They're not to compensate against what we have difficulty with. So they're tools. That's why Pam and I, and we all use these tools now, but not to say like, oh, I'm going to, put a cushion under my chair to feel better.
Yeah.
Like that's for compensating. We're not going to compensate. We're going to reorganize for a lifelong change.
Okay. You kind of touched on a lot of the things I was going to ask you about here, but just to clarify for people, it sounds like you work with mostly kids, but that you'll work with anybody. Is that correct?
Right. So it's the children that come through the door, and we now, like I said, having an amazing fun, like really fun, doing some work with those infants through, 5 years old, those early kids, where the infants, we see that creative crawling. We're seeing that the infant is up on mom and won't, going and doing this work and right away seeing some results where that infant is now going to develop, beautifully. But it is the children that come in the door, and then we work with whole families.
Okay.
We work with whole families, and in that way, what we mean by that is sometimes there's stuckness within the parent. I had a 14-month-old, right?
Yeah.
And you have to work with the whole family unit. I had a 14-month-old who was stuck, and we were moving him along, but then mom did her own emotion release work, and that baby immediately responded and was able to go off and explore on his own and not be, feeling the tie.
And that goes with any kid at any age. And the reality is we all have baggage. I don't care if you want to admit it, we all have baggage.
No, I admit it. I have baggage.
And the child is part of that family network. So it is usually the child who comes through the door, but we've had parents come for classes and individual sessions, a sibling come for, some support. And because I like to say, we go on a journey with the families, and we support them, and sometimes the journey's straight line, sometimes not, and we do what we need to do we want people to be happy. That really is our bottom line.
So the adage there's an adage in Chinese medicine that says to treat the child, treat the parent, and so of course I'm fascinated by that aspect of what you do, because I do think that there's relevance to that. I've seen it many times. Well, so if somebody's going to enter into a program, and I would speak in general, not necessarily to your practice, but just this kind of work, what are they getting into? How long does it take to move through a program?
Well, it depends on the age of the child, because the younger ones tend to move through it quicker because they're closer to the root of where it started. But we really say 4 months to a year, depending, because you don't know how the body's going to respond. We need to find out, where did it get stuck in that development? How far along is it? How willing is the family to work as a family unit to make this change? We offer classes because we really felt that strongly that when you educate the parents, then they can do this work throughout the week at home. They can be in the know. They can see the changes, because noticing is a huge part of our program.
And we notice without judgment or worry. And that's one of the first things we put out there, because there's shame, there's embarrassment, there's all these emotions that come up, and we do our best to just let them people know that we're all human and we don't care. It's okay.
Nobody's judging.
No one's judging, and we don't worry either, because we feel like we could help make the changes.
And so when people enter a program, how long does it start taking for them to say, hey, I'm seeing some change here?
Yeah. It seems to be right away at those
sometimes
days.
right at the first appointment. It's really fun
it's
to see.
that body-mind connection. It's that bringing what has been dormant and just hanging out there in a child, because that's who comes through the door typically, but it's what's been hanging out there that we address it, and we educate the child and the parents at that initial meeting, and the children are saying, oh my gosh, this makes sense. So it's not just me, I hate to use these labels, but they say like being stupid, being whatever. It's not just me.
Something's
wrong with me. Thank you. Yes. It's because I just didn't move enough, and that in itself begins this shift. It's a shift that happens immediately. Yeah, and then from that shift, we notice week after week. Tell me, how is life better for you? I was talking to an 8-year-old boy after maybe this was like 4 or 5 weeks of therapy. How is life better for you? Well, you know what, Christina? We have a reading group. I read to the reading group, and I knew what I read, and I could answer questions afterwards. How about that,
Yeah.
right? That they're noticing real
Right.
life changes. Yeah.
So let's go back to you're talking about root cause, and you're alluding to this happening in utero. And can you speak more to root cause?
Yeah. Primitive reflexes are motor patterns. They're movements that we have in utero in the first year of life, give or take. And they're there to set up our ability to process sensory information.
Okay.
They're there to help us cope with stress. And they're there providing the foundation for vision and auditory development, executive functioning development, and higher level brain.
All those things that our nervous system does that we all take for granted.
That we all take for
Exactly.
granted, yes.
That super
Autonomic
high rate
nervous
communication
system.
network.
Exactly, and the primitive reflexes, once they integrate, it allows the brain stem and what we call the emotional brain to be solid and stable, so that with the chaos and craziness of this world around here, that stable foundation can stay intact, so I can access higher level thinking and problem solve or cope or be flexible and things like that.
More fluidity to the functioning
Yes,
of
and
the
the
Right,
body.
processing of information.
Yeah,
if you
it's
think of-
interesting how you notice stuff when it's not working, but when you don't, you just
Right.
take
Oh,
it for
yes,
granted.
yes,
Hey,
Exactly.
everything's working.
Right.
Yes.
So you think of the developmental pyramid, and at the bottom is actually immune and digestion. So automatic functions our body should be doing, but a lot of kids are struggling with, because the next level are these reflexes. And if these reflexes are not in place, then that fight, flight, freeze response is going to be taking over the chemicals that should be used for that immune and digestion. So we're working down there, really base stuff, real brain stem kind
As
of
you are.
development.
Yeah, you're on the bottom
As you
line
are
of
too.
that
That's it.
pyramid.
I'm treating mostly immune and
Yeah,
digestive
exactly,
issues.
exactly. And then we'll get to that top level. Then we'll get to
Social
the
skill
social, the
training and-
emotional, the executive functioning, and all those things that are happening now. We can't even get there before that solid foundation is put in place.
Excuse me. So speak to how the schools are addressing this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, not as quickly and
As we
as
would
openly
like.
as we would like. As
And we
had hoped.
understand it's a very stressed
Yeah.
system, and it's a hard system to be in.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that when we have teachers or therapists who work in the schools and they come and take some trainings from us, on a small scale, they're able to bring it into their sessions or into their classrooms. We have several kids who will start to do some movements, and they'll say, "Oh, we do this in class." So that on a surface level, the schools
there's
are bringing it in,
They
but it's a
want
hard
to.
system. They
But
want
you know
to,
what?
and it's-
The teachers are stressed. The system is stressed, thinking that they have enough programs. How are we going to do one more? Kind of
Yeah.
thing.
and not fully
But-
understanding the premise
Right.
of this is that it's going to make everybody's job easier if
Excuse
these
me.
kids were more
Well,
integrated.
we're already putting so much stress on teachers these
Right.
days. I'm just
Absolutely.
asking
I
them to know one more
couldn't-
thing.
But we do,
Wonder what it
so
would
we do train, we do workshops for teachers and for schools, right?
Okay.
Then we can go in and consult and say, okay, so you've learned this, what this is. We can come in and show you how to do this in a classroom with a whole class. And we can show you, we can teach the children so that it becomes this piece that has organized us, like I did with my alternative educational support business. They came in, we would begin by doing 45 minutes of academics or 15 minutes movements. It quickly shifted as to how much movement I was doing, because with all that nice movement, they were so organized they could whip out their homework. And then later on in life, they go do their sports and whatnot, and they were organized for that as well. So what we say is that our work is to get that root development in place so that they can access everything else. So they can access the teaching that they're getting, their speech, their OT, whatever it is that they have for other services can be accessed if they do this root cause work.
Right.
It makes life easier everywhere else.
Now, I'm putting you on the spot right now because
Go
you
for
weren't
it.
expecting this, but is there anything that you can teach people watching this that they teach them a trick, teach them something that they can?
Yeah.
Some of this, I was fascinated by watching you do your calm down read. What can you teach people?
What can we teach people? Yeah, so we can teach that. First of all, be a good noticer early on, right? So when I came in, I didn't let that fester and boil until I was so nervous, that it would take more time to get down.
Yeah.
I was like immediately said, you know what? I feel some nerves. Let's do something about that. So I drank water. right? So drinking water.
We take that one for granted.
Yeah,
I mean, it used to
we
be the
do.
first thing I would tell my daughter.
Right on.
If she had a headache or she's stressed, I said, "Did you drink your water?" And of course, you go, "Oh, Mom."
Yeah,
I'm like,
yeah.
but it's the first line of defense. Another one that I find very helpful that kids are remembering to do is something called hookups from Brain Gym, and it's great at bedtime. Just laying in bed and doing this to help calm the system to go to sleep. A lot of our kiddos are struggling to sleep.
Yeah.
They're going to cross their feet, and then they do this pretzel position, and then your tongue is at the roof of your mouth where you would click.
Hypothalamus contact.
What?
Hypothalamus contact.
Tip of the tongue up against the hard
Yeah.
palate. We call it the hypothalamus contact.
And
Or the
tell me what
connection
it
between
does.
central and governing meridian.
There you go.
I know, there's so many reasons why that tongue is so
It's like,
important.
it slows the heart rate down is what it does.
All
And-
right, so we're crossing the legs.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just rest, relax your shoulders down and tongue at the roof of your mouth and breathe. And I find kids, once they get into this, or adults, if you're into it for about a minute, maybe a minute and a half, the system all of a sudden just,
What's happening?
it shifts down. It shifts the
It
system
organizes
down
the
into-
left and right brain communication because now you're left and right,
Yeah.
right? Top and bottom, which is our emotional midline. It slows down our heart rate with the tongue to the roof of our mouth. So it just, the system just calms right down.
I noticed watching, we were talking about movement earlier, and our culture is probably the least moving culture on the planet.
More and more, yes.
Yeah, well, I just of course you jump on the exercise piece there.
I
I'm
was
kinda-
just thinking that,
but
moving
I'm-
naturally.
But I'm
yes.
curious about how, if there's any relevance there, but then I'm also wanting to wheel in, I'm always working with people, we oftentimes don't use our sits bones, so
Right.
we sit so often, and people are doing this kind of stuff. They
Yeah.
just,
I'm
a
glad
long
I'm
day, they
sitting
sit
up
on
right
their
now.
couch, they do this kind of
Right,
thing.
right.
And I'm thinking, well, do you understand, you're coming into me with back pain or whatever it is, I can't have you doing this kind of thing.
Right.
But
Well,
there's tells in that.
Yes, there is. There's a
Yes.
lot of tells, and what
Right.
for my own personal self, and we see it in adults all the time, is that there's a possibility that there's a primitive reflex movement pattern that supports posture that never finished.
That
Okay?
happened to me.
And
Can you
as
fix
we
that
were
line?
developing
Yes,
this.
but the big
Yeah.
one is that we see, and this often leads to inattention, hyperactivity, can't sit still, those kind of things. But it's called the STNR reflex, symmetrical tonic neck reflex. It's the crawling reflex. It was the motor pattern the reflex that got us into the crawling position. And if you think about the crawling position, it's on all fours, right? But if I tip it to the vertical position, it's sitting. So we have kids go back. What's it like to be in the crawling position? They'll get down on the floor and they're like, "Oh, I don't like this. My neck hurts. This and that." And this is within 10 seconds. I'm not talking 2 hours. And we explain, well, if it's uncomfortable there, and it was uncomfortable there when you were 1 year old, so you skipped it. You got right up to walk, or you crawled in a weird different way. Now you're in class. You're back in that position. And it's not feeling good. So you're going to do what you got to do to get out of that position.
Yeah.
But it's a primitive motor pattern that they're fighting against all day long.
Interesting.
And
Yeah.
so, I'm going to sit like this because, man, that's a lot more comfortable.
Right, you're gonna
Because this is
compensate.
not comfortable.
Yeah. Lots of compensations come about.
Yes, and we
Yeah.
all do. I mean, you go to an airport and watch how people sit.
Well, I have the story. I was
Yeah.
at the airport, and this 20-something girl was across from me, and she's on the phone with her boyfriend, right? So she starts on the phone with her leg going, right? And she's like this, and then she slips down into that position, and her leg stops. And then she realized, oh, what am I doing? So she sits up again, but her leg starts going again. And then she slipped down, and she kept doing that. And I said, oh, sweetie, you're STNR.
yeah.
Right?
Well,
Can we do something about that?
Of course,
Yeah.
I look
Right.
at that person and say, there's somebody who's just not comfortable in her own body.
Exactly. But- and we know
that's
why,
the
and
bottom
that's- and
line,
that's the bottom
and-
line.
but that's hard for an 8-year-old
Yeah.
to say, "Mom, I'm
Yeah.
not comfortable in my
Yeah,
own
right.
body," because what does that mean? You know,
Right, right.
that means just sit still and pay attention. Well, you really should say sit still or pay attention, because it's not going to
Can't
be both.
Yeah. And I thought of something else for the movements. You asked me to share some movements. Some movements we do on our own. Like we say, oh my goodness, right? We do that. And so that these are our positive release points, bringing all that blood flow up to our, reasoning brain, so we can think. So we do things automatically. We kind of find ourselves rubbing our ears. I kind of find myself just doing this automatically. I think apes go, they know something,
I just
right?
did that this morning.
There you go, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so when you find you're doing a movement automatically, just check in with that. Oh, how is this helping me? How does that make me feel better? Because that's a move my body needs. And so that's a tool for you.
Right. Yeah. Someone once said that our program is a systematic mind-body connection program, because we teach people how to do the mind-body using goals, noticing, and movement. And I thought that was a nice description.
Or the other child who said, this is, this is interesting but seemingly useless information, but somehow it works. This was out of the mouth of babes.
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you want to finish with before we wrap things up?
We just want to spread the word that there's another option. Another option from medication, another option from counseling, because a lot of these kiddos don't necessarily want to talk about how they're feeling because they don't know how to put it into words. And we really just want to help people know that there's an option.
So one thing I should clarify is or have you clarify for people is, how do they find, you used the people that taught you, that was Brain Gym, I believe. And,
yes.
How do they go find people in general? Like, what are they looking for? Because people are even starting to know my, acupuncturist. They're getting that, but how do they find people like you?
Right. I think the quickest way to find people who are doing this work is to Google Primitive Reflexes and Learning.
Okay.
And it's amazing to see what comes up. And there are some other programs all over the world, and it's using similar modalities as we use. The other one is Brain Gym. That's where we both started. We're both licensed in Brain Gym, so they give a list of instructors for classes. They don't necessarily have their business to work with kids, but they're instructors of Brain Gym, and we offer that as well.
I want to thank you both for being on the show. Pam, Christina, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, Paul.
A lot of great information. And everybody, thank you very much for tuning in to another episode of Health Naturally. My name is Paul Gerst.